Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is episode 5 of my series Beyond the Bible, where we look at all written religious works in Christianity outside of the Protestant canon. And today we are continuing to work our way through the Apocrypha, getting to the book of Sirach, sometimes known as Ecclesiasticus, which is a book of wisdom literature. And I love wisdom literature. I don't care from what source, what culture, what religion, what ideology. I think it's fascinating to look and read what people at the time thought was good, beneficial, moral, ethical, etc. And I don't know if this will surprise many of you or not, but there are many beautiful things in this that I'm excited to share with you. And there's also unbelievably horrible things that I'm excited to share with you. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to switch things up. We're still going to start with Canon Controversy and authorship, date, and context. We're going to do those very quickly. We'll spend some time in the third category, book overview, where we break everything down section by section. Go very quickly again through points 4 and 5, literary analysis and main themes. And then at point 6, instead of just problematic passages, I'm going to show you around 10 passages that I think are really wise, smart, beautiful, ethical, good for teaching, instruction, etc. And then about 10 that are just terrible. So stick around to the end on this one. But without further ado, let's get into point 1, Canon Controversy. This one's really simple. Luther's doing the Reformation, and this book was in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Bible. But at that time, they did not have a manuscript version of it in the Hebrew, and that was just a big no-no. There's some other considerations, but generally speaking, I think this book actually would have squeaked in if they knew what we know now today. I think it was in the 1900s, that recently, that a few people came upon the Hebrew manuscript, or at least parts. I think we're up to 2/3 of the book have been recovered. So it's interesting. If we had known that back then and Luther had kept it in the Bible, would our Protestant canon have 67? What this points to me, and the Catholics are going to be like, ha, see, gotcha. But one of the things this continues to point to me is how much this canonization process had nothing to do with God, nothing to do with any kind of divine will or inspired books. These ones are in, these ones are out. This has been a process by man, and not just for the Protestant version, but even the Catholic canon or the Orthodox canon or any of these other differences. It's just men that have made up decisions from the thinking of men who created categories by men to put these man-made written books in and give the green light or not to. Talk about the book of Sirach with a Protestant, specifically in the US, and you will get blank stares. Most of them won't even know that that is a book in their fellow Christians, the Catholics' Bible. They'll have no idea. Show them something and tell them it's from God, and they will reject that. But to the Catholics and to some Orthodox, it is inspired word of God. I'm just always blown away that this isn't a bigger issue to all believers all the time. So moving straight into point 2, this authorship, context, and date. We know a lot about this book. This is one of the few books in general, no matter what canon we're talking about, where we get a listed specific author. And this author typically just goes by Ben Sira. There was a mistranslation that actually made them think it was Sirach, thus the name of the book, but it's not. It's Ben Sira, and the first name is Yeshua, or Jesus, not to make things confusing. So this Jesus Ben Sira was a scribe and teacher in Jerusalem at the time. It seems he would have written this in Hebrew, which we now have, but it was his grandson who translated it into the Greek and writes a prologue, and that's what gets into the Septuagint, which again is a much better understanding than we have for most books. And the grandson is even explaining the reason that he is doing this, and this is in his prologue, is he's preserving the work of his grandfather and trying to expand it or explain it to the Jews living in the Hellenistic world. Now, there are many textual variants between the Hebrew and the Greek version. In fact, in the Greek version, you often see a lot of added theological nuance where it seems like the ideas are expanded upon, again, maybe to make them better fit with the new audience. So we won't go through a long list of those variations, but they are there, they are significant, and it just goes to continue to show what we see with so much of the Bible as it goes through its evolution, which is the revealing of these interpretive expansions during translation. Again, a major problem for consistency for a religion that is all supposed to have one truth. The timing would have been between 200 and 175 BCE, so still a couple hundred years before the next Jesus. But again, during this Hellenistic period where the Jews at the time were facing a lot of pressure from Greek culture and tradition to assimilate and adapt. Sirach, like many of these books that were written during this time and within the Apocrypha, aims to bridge that gap. but still reinforce that Jewish identity by always looking back at the law and the wisdom of the Jewish people and their past. And so that's this book. I think, again, really interesting, but let me break it down for you within a few segments. This book has 51 chapters, but I think we can group them pretty succinctly. So the first grouping, we'll do chapters 1 through 4, and we'll call this the pursuit of wisdom. Here, wisdom is introduced as a central requirement to not only understanding life, but aligning that life with the will of God. This book emphasizes that wisdom is not just some practical thing. It's not purely intellectual. It is deeply spiritual. So we talk about the divine origin of wisdom. We talk about the fear of the Lord. Chapter 3 brings in parental wisdom, which is kind of out of place here, but again, alluding back to the wisdom from the Father to us, and then wraps up this section with wisdom as a guide, where it personifies wisdom like typical Lady Wisdom. In this case, it is a nurturing mother, guiding the righteous, but not just guiding, also testing their resolve. We see that in the Wisdom of Solomon. We also see it in some of the traditional wisdom literature like Job and Ecclesiastes from the Protestant Canon, which is a really interesting idea and one I'd like to do a breakdown video on, where wisdom is this refiner in this way, this tester. Like most wisdom books, we take a segment, this will be segment 2, where we get into practical application of said wisdom. So we move from kind of the abstract qualities of the purpose of wisdom and the origination of wisdom and how it's recognized in our Maker through fear and thus repentance, respect, duty, etc., into the practical advice for daily living. The key themes in this section, it covers a good amount. It starts off still kind of in that transition of the abstract, and it's about trusting in God's timing. There is a warning against this arrogance or impatience with God's divine timing or justice. There's kind of a messed up verse here that I'll save for the end. Then it gets into a really pretty part, which is a nice verse I'll save for the end, and that's on friendship. Then we get some advice on controlling our speech and the importance of that, the fallout of that. We talk about humility and moderation, and it wouldn't be a book of wisdom if we didn't have a lot of warnings strewn throughout. So that would be kind of the fifth key takeaway of segment 2 here, are all of the warnings against laziness and dishonesty and being a fool. The next segment kind of gets back on track with the real purpose of wisdom is simply to be able to recognize God and his glory better, to praise God and his creation. So this is a bit more where we get into the personification of wisdom. She even speaks to us in the first person, emphasizing her divine origin and her connection to creation. This might have been another way that the reformers would have felt uncomfortable with this book. Again, we saw this with the Wisdom of Solomon, so I won't repeat myself too much. But wisdom and the personification of wisdom takes on this other divine element, not quite as high as God, but lowly, but also not part of the Trinity, truly almost getting into a polytheistic nature in some cases when talking about her responsibility. I mean, she says some pretty bold things here. In 24:3, she says, "I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist." I mean, that's reminiscent to when we hear at the beginning of creation, the Spirit of God moving over the waters. Again, a very significant placement of this personified being or entity. Next, we kind of get a tie-in between wisdom and the law. That comes to us from 24:23. All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law that Moses commanded us. So really wanting to make that connection. Then it goes back to reflecting on creation. I'll give you another verse. "Marvel at the grandeur of God's work in nature, from celestial bodies to weather phenomena." There's another verse that says, "The sun looks down on everything with its light, and the work of the Lord is full of his glory." So again, wisdom is the recognition of God via his creation. It starts to get into this kind of general revelation idea, this but the trees kind of argumentation. And it's clearly from a lack of understanding. This God of the gaps, this seeing the creator, a very specific creator, by the way, not just a creator in general. This isn't deism. This is making a very specific claim that we should be able to see God, Yahweh God, clearly in his creation. And that's just simply not the case. And for every one of those gaps that we have knocked down and closed with science, it only makes this God more and more and more obscure. And then the ending part of this segment does kind of get back into the real world, and it talks about work, the duty and need for that, but also recognizing, seeing, and displaying real wisdom, divine wisdom in and through those things. And then segment 4 kind of takes a quick left turn, and we get into some of these hymns and recognitions of the patriarchs. books. It's a historical reflection all of a sudden, which again, many of these Apocrypha books that came in this in-between period are trying to do that, trying to almost get street cred, if you will, by backing up to the original. So we start with praising the patriarchs, and you can hear it here in chapters 44 through 50, but we start with this famous line, "Let us now sing the praises of famous men, and proceed to recount the deeds of figures like Enoch, Noah, Abraham, and Moses." And then many of those chapters go on to do just that, and they walk through these men and their great works of faith and wisdom. After those men, it goes on to the high priest Simon. Then we get this hymn of creation. That's how this segment ends, which I think is interesting and kind of fitting. And then we'll get to our last segment here, which is simply the last chapter, chapter 51, where we have, of course, more warnings that conclude this for us, as well as some exhortations. But it ends with this appeal to live virtuously. But let's move on to point 4, which is literary analysis. And we'll make this really quick. When it comes to genre, we call this wisdom literature, though it definitely mixes some poetry and some didactic elements. In terms of style, we're combining aphorism, proverbs, and some hymns, and again, poetry. In regard to structure and theme, it's divided pretty well into these thematic blocks, if you will, as opposed to following a narrative, which we even see, like in the book of Job, as a completely different way of sharing this Jewish kind of wisdom. And that's really about it. Let's move into point 5, main themes, see if you can guess them. First is defining wisdom, or the understanding that wisdom is not just practical, though it is, and it's expected that you do so, but it's divine. And so first you need to seek and fear God, and then you will get the wisdom to live practically that will be its own reward, even though that is contrary to what we see in much of the New Testament and from the mouth of Jesus himself. The Old Testament is full of this kind of idea, and even the Apocrypha, like we're talking about now, where there is this idea that you can live well, and it will, if having done the right things, it being life, will reward you, or even God will bless you because he sees those things. Verse after verse after verse after verse after verse that talks about this, because that was the carrot and stick in the Old Testament. It was about physical blessings and curses in this life now to your body as a human on this planet. The New Testament shifts that focus, that goalpost, to the future, the afterlife, to heaven or hell as the great carrot and stick. And that is why Jesus can straight up warn that to follow him means you will be cursed, you will be hated, you will lose in this life. But again, not consistent with what we see from the older texts. So wisdom is divine is how we'll wrap that up. The second one, of course, you cannot talk about wisdom without talking about the fear of the Lord. Reverence, which is the nicest way of saying it, although many of the verses that talk about fear of the Lord truly mean fearing what the Lord can do to you if you don't, is foundational for understanding wisdom and morality. The third one is ethical living, again, getting into some of those practical tips. And the fourth one, and this is a main goal or theme of many books of the Apocrypha, is to appreciate, respect, and not forget tradition, reinforcing Jewish customs, law, and wisdom, even as we adapt and assimilate to this new culture. Huge. So let's move into our final section. Again, typically just problematic passages, but let's start with some of the good ones. What are some of the things I think stand out as wise, useful, beneficial, edifying, etc.? The first one would be the value of friendship. That's Sirach 6:14 through 16. A faithful friend is a sturdy shelter. He who finds one finds a treasure. A faithful friend is beyond price, and no amount can balance their worth. That's a really beautiful passage for a friend, for what friendship is, can be, and does when treated properly. The next one, and this is the problem with what you're going to see with a lot of religious wisdom literature in general. I don't care if you're talking about wisdom from the Quran or from the Vedas or from Buddhist text, etc. It still links up sometimes to a more spiritual matter, but the first part is often very beautiful. You'll see what I mean here. Sirach 3:17 through 18. My child, perform your tasks with humility. Then you will be loved by those whom God accepts. The greater you are, the more you must humble yourself. See, mixed in here is a good message of humility, which, even from a secular perspective, I am totally on board with. I think if the whole world had a bit more humility, we'd be in a lot better spot. I think if Christians could humble themselves a bit more, the religion would be in a much better spot. Now, the problem is it's still entwined with so much religious terminology, like, then you will be loved by those whom God accepts. But in general, doing your tasks with humility, staying humble, looking for where you might be wrong, being open to change, these are, if not overdone, very healthy. Next would be what Sirach says about controlling our speech. Sirach 28:12-13 says, if you blow on a spark, it will glow. If you spit on it, it will be put out. Both come out of your mouth. We see this echoed in other parts of the Bible as well. The importance of the tongue that can both bless and curse is how it is said in other verses. And I think it's an excellent recognition of the power of speech and the duty of controlling it. Next, the importance of learning and listening. Sirach 6:32-33. If you are willing, my child, you can be disciplined, and if you apply yourself, you will become clever. If you love to listen, you will gain knowledge. The next one's beautiful too. Sirach 4:1-4. Do not deprive the poor of their livelihood, and do not keep needy eyes waiting. Do not grieve the hungry or anger one in need. Promoting not just generosity, but true compassion. Love it. And I could say some things about the hypocrisy, but we're just going to leave it alone. Let's enjoy good verses when we get them. Another sound piece of advice that we get in many parts of the Bible is Sirach 28:11. An ill-tempered person fights at will, but the wise will be patient. In other words, be slow to anger, which is what we see elsewhere in the Bible, and I've always loved that. The problem is we don't have a God that is slow to anger, and I'm going to be doing a video on that soon. The next one is Sirach 7:15. Do not hate hard work or farming, which was created by the Most High. Forgetting the fact that it's specific to farming and that is created by the Most High. No, the invention of agriculture is an amazing part of human history that Yahweh had absolutely nothing to do with. But the idea of not hating hard work, of not being lazy, call me whatever you want, I think that's good advice. I think it's important for us to have the personal responsibility, for those of us who can, to work and provide what we can, even just to be able to be generous and beneficial to those that can't. So again, I think a lot of this aligns with itself and is rather lovely. The next one's the importance of generosity. Sirach 12:1. When you do a good deed, know to whom you are doing it, and your kindness will have its effect. I think this is actual wisdom, because anyone can say, be generous. Anyone can say, do good things for others, and maybe it'll come back around to you. Some idea of karma or a God that's watching and will reward you later. The connection between karma beliefs and a belief in an all-seeing God that will punish or reward you based off what you do and think, they're almost indistinguishable except who you're giving credit for the doing of. I think that's something we need to talk about more. I love when video ideas just hit me while we're going through some random book of the Apocrypha, but the true wisdom here is in being thoughtful, knowing who you're helping and why, and if you're doing so in the best, most efficient possible way. But it's not all pretty advice from Sirach. Let's talk about some of the negative ones. How about Sirach 25:24? From a woman, sin had its beginning, and because of her, we all die. Again, this tale is as old as time. Many people will point to books like this or Proverbs and talk about, hey, God doesn't hate women. Look, he even personifies wisdom itself as a woman. Yeah, and in these same books, he makes sure to remind us, or the author does, that women are ultimately why we are all in the pickle we are in. If it wasn't for Eve, even Paul says this when he's justifying why women can't speak in church. You're the weak ones. You're the ones who were deceived. If it wasn't for you, we would have been just fine is kind of the undertone. It's stupid and disgusting. I'll try to come up with a specific verse, but my next one is just Sirach 30, where we hear about how to bring up a child, and it starts like this. A father who loves his son will whip him often so that he can be proud of him later. If a son is disciplined, he will be of some use, and his father can boast of him to his friends. Anyone who gives good guidance to his son cannot only take pride in him among his friends, but he can make his enemies jealous. While the father is alive, the sight of his son makes him happy, and when he dies, he has no regrets. He is not really dead because his son is like him. He has left someone to take vengeance on his enemies and to return the favors he owes to his friends. It gets worse, you guys. I'm just going to keep reading for a minute. But anyone who spoils his son will have to bandage his wounds. His heart will stop every time he hears a shout. An untamed horse is going to be stubborn, and an undisciplined son is no different. If you pamper your child and play with him, he will be a disappointment and a source of grief. Laugh with him now, and one day you will cry over him, grinding your teeth in regret. Whip him while he is still a child, and make him respect your authority. If you don't, he will be stubborn and disobedient and cause you nothing but sorrow. It goes on, and it's still terrible. This is naive, incorrect, and ridiculous thinking, and this isn't coming from some gentle parenting generation that is overcorrecting for the sins of our fathers. No. Studies, psychological effect of rearing children. I'm not saying to spoil them. I'm not saying to never correct them. I'm not saying that there shouldn't ever be consequences for actions to help learn and improve. This is not a black or white fallacy. And please do not partake in it where it's like, oh, well, the opposite of this is just to give your kid everything. No, it isn't. But even the motivations here are ridiculous. To be able to brag to your friends, to make sure that you have someone that replicates you so that when you die, you're still an essence here. That's so human. That's like the opposite of what you would expect from a God who says, this earth is pointless. Do not be a citizen of humanity. Store up treasures for yourself in heaven. No. Beat your son now into submission so that when you're gone, you have an advocate still on earth who can still curse your enemies for you and get revenge even though you're in the dirt. What beautiful wisdom. However, did this God come up with that? It's sick, it's stupid, it's twisted, it's naive, it's counterproductive, and it has bad motivations. If you want some really sick apologetics on anything from racism to slavery, go to Sirach 33 and you can read it from the beginning, but starting in verse 7. Why are some days holier than other days, even though the sun rises on every day of the year? So this analogy is people. We're all people, but some people, just like some days of the year, are special, meaning the rest are not. And here's where he's going to go with it. Every human was made from the earth, just as Adam was. But the Lord, in his wisdom, made them all different and gave them different tasks. He blessed some, making them honored and holy, keeping them near him. Others he cursed. See, that's so different. The analogy immediately falls apart. I'm sorry, do we have any bad days of the year? It's one thing to say there's neutral days and days we reserve. It's one thing to say all people are people and some have risen up. But the analogy gets broken because now it's some people are lifted up, but others are purposely cursed, kept far from God. That's not fair, that's not just, and that's not loving. Just as clay is in the potter's hands for him to shape as he pleases, so we are in the hands of our Creator for him to do with as he wishes. But then we get to the part I meant to get to, verse 24. This is about the treatment of slaves. A donkey should be given its fodder and its burden, and it should be beaten. A slave should be given food and work, and should be disciplined. If you make your slaves work, you can set your mind at ease. If you don't keep him busy, he will be looking for freedom. You can use a harness and yoke to tame an animal, and a slave can be tortured in the stocks. Keep him at work and don't let him be idle. Idleness can only teach him how to make trouble. Work is what he needs. If he won't obey you, put him in chains. Now that's horrendous, and we've taken a lot of time here, but to be fair, I'm going to read you the next lines as if they fix this. But don't be too severe with anyone, and never be unfair. If you have a slave, treat him as you would want to be treated. You bought him with your hard-earned money, treat him as a brother. You need him as you need yourself. If you mistreat him and he runs away, where are you going to go look for him? That ends that part. So it wasn't treat him well because he's a person. It was you bought him. You spent good money on him. This is how you don't have to do all of this work. And if you are too harsh with him, he'll just try to get away. And then what? Then what are you going to do? This very book just endorsed buying slaves, owning slaves, torturing slaves, chaining slaves, and then some practical advice. Don't treat them too harshly, otherwise you'll have to deal with them wanting to get away from you. Yeah, because they're people, not property, but you don't see that difference. This feels like a really good time to say, time out. This is why, despite any nice things that I said earlier, I don't treat the Bible or the Apocrypha or whatever you want to call it with any amount of actual respect, just because there's some really pretty neat, smart things in it. Because there's also this, which just goes to show what a product of its time and place it was. It was clearly written by men, for men, not for women, not for slaves, not for children. And if somehow I'm wrong and this was all inspired by God and he is on board with this message and these verses, then he's horrible. How utterly disgusting. But I have more. Sirach 42:14. Better is the wickedness of a man than a woman who does good. It is woman who brings shame and disgrace. I mean, this is essentially saying that women are inherently inferior to men. Even a man's wickedness is better than a woman's good. Are you kidding me? We get more fear-based stuff. Those who fear fear the Lord will not disobey his words. There's more obsession with male honor and toxic masculinity and hate of women, more double standards for moral behavior. Look at this tribalistic xenophobia. There are two nations that my soul detests, and the third is not even a people. How gross. And I'll just end with Sirach 2:5. For gold is tested in the fire, and those found acceptable in the furnace of humiliation. This glorifying of suffering and this potential passivity in the face of injustice, I think is gross. It's not wise, it's not smart, it's not brave, it's not cool. It's old, it's dumb, it's ridiculous, it's petty, and it's immoral. And I don't care if you think I have a right to say that or not, but keep in mind, what you're saying is, who are you to judge a God who created everything, but hates some groups of people, thinks less of women, allows slavery, and wants you to beat your children so that they don't embarrass you later? Look what you're standing up for before you tell me why I can't speak against it. But that's it. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. I love working through the Apocrypha. I think there's a ton for us to learn. I think there's a ton of stuff that many Christians, especially Protestants, have no idea. And again, keep in mind, if good old Martin Luther most likely had known about the Hebrew versions of this book and these horrendous passages would be included in our biblical Protestant canon. And if they were, you would have apologists that would make excuses for them. The same apologist, who many of which are Protestant and don't respect the Apocrypha and have no problem calling out, well, yeah, those verses, they're not good, but that's not the inspired word of God. It's not in our canon. But there's this alternate timeline where it very well could have been in the canon and they would have been making excuses for it. And I think that is so telling. I think it's so important to understand that. It is not that the Protestants or the Catholics or the Orthodox or anyone who has any canon is so convinced that their books are actually good and perfect. It is that someone put them in a group and told them they were good and perfect, and then it's been their job to defend that because it's the belief they already have despite the text. But they also live in the modern day with modern morals where we know that women are equal, we know that slavery is bad, we know that treating children abysmally is not productive for anything. And so out come the excuses. But I'll stop. I'm really excited about Sunday's video. I think it's a really important one. That's all I'll say about it for now. So I'll see you Sunday. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, GVI, Joe, Kiboga, Perry, Rocket, Sean, and Tom; my Humanist Heroes, James, Jared, Christy, and Thronis; my Atheist Advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Lisa, Paul, Sparky, and Todd; as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.